Well, a very big welcome from me, David Oliver. This is a Faith and Corona broadcast special. A big welcome too today, by the way, to my two guests, Rick Thomas, who I'll introduce momentarily, and Mike Beaumont, who's an international Bible teacher, an author, and a broadcaster. So a big welcome to both. Also a big welcome to the All About Heaven books community. Some of you will be watching this for the very first time, particularly because of the nature of the topic today, which is vaccines for COVID. Are they safe? Should we take one? How did we get here? Are there any ethical challenges, and much, much more? My primary guest today is Dr. Rick Thomas, who, as my introduction suggests, is a medical doctor, also been a senior church leader, in fact, a pastor for over 3 decades, and is also a bioethics person. Works for the Christian Medical Fellowship, which is an organization in the UK, 2 days a week with a focus on bioethics. So we couldn't have a more gifted or qualified person to join us today. Plus, I happen to know Rick personally. Him and his wife Liz are outstandingly gifted pastorally and have responsibility across a number of regions for pastoral care and input. So a big welcome, Rick. Thanks for joining us today. Now, folks, Rick has written an outstandingly helpful and clear PDF. It's going to be available. Up on screen, you see the usual place to request it. It's free. Go to davidoliverbooks.com, use the contact form and just simply say Rick's PDF, please. And we'll get that off to you within 24 hours or so. Rick, I have to start. In fact, before I even ask you the first question, here we are, first couple of days in January. The fantastic news in the UK that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has now been approved by the MHRA in the UK, or MHRA, whichever way around that is. You can correct me momentarily. First injection happened this morning. That's great news, I think. And of course, the Pfizer-BioNTech is already approved here in the UK. In the US, where a lot of our viewers reside, Pfizer and Moderna are both approved at the moment. And yet, we've been praying for this thing on this broadcast. We've been praying together over months for a vaccine, and yet as soon as it's released, already conspiracy theories abound. People I was speaking to in the States and in the UK last week, concerned about taking a vaccine. I kind of stagger with that thought, but apparently it's a common thought.
Indeed, and it is hard to understand, isn't it? Perhaps we've got to go back some ways to understand the reasons behind it. I think there's a good deal of superstition involved and a good deal of suspicion when it comes to the worries that the government might be trying to sort of land something on us that's got hidden agendas behind it. Beginning of the 20th century, science was seen as the great hope for mankind. And then perhaps by the middle of that century, atomic bombs are being built and our oceans are being polluted, and people are beginning to think rather differently about the downsides of big science. And a new generation at the beginning of this century perhaps has a much more cautious approach, much less optimistic, looking perhaps more skeptically at these things. And I think that spilled over into the whole issue of vaccines right now.
So one of the common questions, Rick, I know you address this in your paper, but it's also one that's been asked of me, is we've got 3 candidate vaccines right now, in the sense that 3 that are likely to be approved in the developed world within weeks, if they're not already approved. Are they safe?
Yes, it is tempting to think that that they've been produced so rapidly. Surely safety corners must have been cut. And indeed, that was really the thought that led me to look into this in the first place. And I'm satisfied, talking to you today, that we can be absolutely sure that they are safe. Yes, they have been produced very quickly. Generally, it's taken about 10 years to bring a new vaccine into use. And here in 10 months, really, the same distance has been covered. But that's because enormous amounts of focus has gone into this. Huge quantities of investment has gone in. And the normal processes by which new vaccines are approved has run alongside the development of the vaccine. So rather than
different, Rick, that's new.
Yes, it is new. Whenever you're conducting clinical trials, normally you have to wait at every step of the process for the work you've done to be looked at and discussed in sort of regulatory authority committee meetings, and that process is very long and drawn out, and you may be stranded for weeks whilst you wait for permission to move on to the next stage. In the development of these vaccines, the approval process has run side by side with the developmental process, and the huge focus that has involved other jobs being set aside, put on the back burner in order to bring these things to birth as rapidly as possible. And I'm satisfied that corners have not been cut. Here in the UK, there's a very stringent process by which the research and the development of new vaccines is scrutinized. It's considered to be one of the most robust procedures globally, and I think we can be sure that before these things are put into people's arms, all of that work has been done and been done robustly.
Very good. In fact, our very next broadcast, folks, is with the husband of the lead statistician of the Oxford vaccine, who happens to be in our Salt Light family of churches. That's Sheridan Boise, and he'll be next on the Faith and Corona special broadcast. Rick, I wanted to ask you about effectiveness. We get multiple stats from our news, CNN, Sky, BBC, and other news providers, and there seem to be this kind of slightly disparate set of numbers. So can you explain to us as lay people what effectiveness actually means, and how effective will the two current leading contenders, that's the Pfizer-BioNTech and the AstraZeneca-Oxford vaccine, how effective actually are they?
Well, let's start with the Pfizer one, since that was the first to be approved in this country. The phase 3 trials, which involve tens of thousands of volunteers, suggest that there's a 90% plus effectiveness in preventing the symptoms of the disease being manifest. So prevention of getting sick is very high. 90% is way beyond the wildest dreams of the vaccine producers when they first started out on this. So they were delighted that the studies threw up those figures.
But Rick, let me just interject there. Sorry, you're in a flow, but this is important. You just used a phrase there which raised a question in my mind straight away, and that was prevent the symptoms of the disease. So are you saying then effectiveness doesn't mean we don't catch it? What are you actually saying there?
Well, what I'm saying is that even if you contact the disease and you are infected by the disease, you will not know that you're infected, or you will experience only very mild symptoms, because your body is already armed to deal with it. That's the benefit of having been vaccinated, obviously, by an effective vaccine, that your body is preset to attack that invader. So you may get some mild symptoms, but for many people, they won't even know that they've had an engagement with the virus.
Really important statement there, which I hadn't clocked before our conversation just now. Effectiveness doesn't mean I don't get it necessarily. It means that, but it could mean in that percentage you're giving us that some of us will actually contract the infection but not manifest the symptoms. That does raise another question, which I think we've heard a fair bit about in the news. Does that mean I'm potentially then still capable of transmitting it, even though I am protected?
That's the big unknown at the moment. There's not sufficient experience with these vaccines. There's not sufficient data available to know if we will also be prevented from transmitting the disease because we've got immunity towards it ourselves. That is a separate issue. So 90% or even better, some say up to 95% with the Pfizer vaccine, protection for you personally, but whether you can infect somebody else isn't yet clear. With the AstraZeneca vaccine coming online just today in the UK, that is thought to be about 70% effective. In fact, a small subset of the people who took part in phase 3 trials had a half dose given to them in the first injection and then the full dose in the second injection 3 weeks apart. And they actually seemed to show a higher rate of overall protection, again, up to about 90% following the second injection. But the numbers involved in that subset were too small to be able to go straight to that dosage regime. So the doses being given today are a full dose as the first jab, and the same dose will be given in the second jab some weeks later. So it may be that with more detail, more data, the AstraZeneca vaccine will be given in a half dose to begin with, and in a full dose later on. Excuse me when we've got somebody at the front door, but I'm hoping Liz will hear that.
That's real life. So to a layman then, Rick, 70% versus 90%, there's an instinct, I guess those who are going to take the vaccine are just grateful to get one, full stop. But, well, wouldn't I rather have the Pfizer one? And why aren't they both 100%? How come vaccines aren't 100%? So talk us through that.
Oh, wow. That's probably beyond my pay grade, Dave, but I'll do my best. Yes, I'd feel like you. If it was a simple choice between getting the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine today, I'd vote for the Pfizer because of the better protection that it's going to give. But it isn't as simple as that. Governments have to pre-order these vaccines, and they do so with the best knowledge available at the time, and of course the cost that it's going to be to them. So in the UK, it's much more likely that people will get the AstraZeneca vaccine because the government pre-ordered 100 million doses of that, and only a much smaller number, 20 million or so, of the Pfizer vaccine. Why is it not 100%? Well, nothing in medicine is 100%, and not everybody who gets the jab will develop antibodies, and the reasons for that are very technical. But generally speaking, a 70% efficacy rate would be considered good. I mean, the annual flu vaccines that people get rarely get up to 70% effectiveness. So you're guessing what the genetic strains of the influenza virus are going to be next year when you're preparing the vaccine for that year. And whether you guess right will determine the efficacy of the jab that year. So, you know, the flu virus mutates every year, more than once, quite often. And you're trying to predict what it will look like. So we already know that the COVID-19 virus is mutating, and there's a new strain in the UK which appears to be much more infective than the previous strain, such that now 2/3 of the new cases in the UK are with the new strain of virus. But it's likely that the existing vaccines will still be effective against that second variant, even though it's got, I think, 17 different genetic variations from the original vaccine, the original virus. The vaccine should still be effective against that new one. So it's a complicated business guessing the exact shape of vaccines as they're going to mutate.
So I think, at the risk of putting words in your mouth, I think what you're saying is normal vaccines take 10 years and 70% for a 10-year development, 70% effectiveness. People would be getting out the champagne and celebrating. So absolutely, we should be really doubly pleased at 70% plus in a 10-month development period. I think that's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
So, Rick, one of the questions that I've already been asked is, will a vaccine mess with my DNA? And I guess behind that is, what am I putting into my body? Can it have other impacts other than effectiveness, which we've just discussed, and helping me from getting sick, preventing me from getting sick? What's your answer to that?
Okay, short answer, Dave, is no, they don't mess with your DNA. They won't affect your offspring. And it's important to say perhaps that the two front runners here in the UK, at least, that are now in use, work in different ways. The end result is the same. It sort of arms your immunity against COVID-19 if you encounter it. But the way they do that varies. So with the Pfizer and indeed the Moderna vaccines, these are called messenger RNA or mRNA vaccines. Molecules are made in a laboratory, little synthetic molecules of proteins that are injected into your arm, and your body's own cells produce huge amounts of the spike protein that is on the surface of the virus. Those spike proteins are released into your system and recognized by your body's own immune mechanisms, which then manufacture antibodies towards the spike protein. That process takes a few weeks within your body. If you encounter the COVID-19 the virus before you've been vaccinated, it still takes your body several weeks to mount its immune response, and you can get very sick in that period of time. Just how sick you get depends upon how fit you are, how old you are, how big a dose you've encountered, and so on. The point of taking the vaccine is that it gives your body breathing space to build that immune response without making you sick. So with the mRNA vaccines, it works in that one way. The way in which the virus is introduced to you with AstraZeneca is a little different in that it uses a vector, which is another virus, a harmless chimpanzee virus, gives a chimpanzee a cold in the normal way. Well, that virus is deactivated, and the DNA of the COVID vaccine are inserted into that vector virus and injected into your arm. You can tell by how much I'm laboring this explanation that it's a complex business, Dave, but at the end of the day, the result is the same. Your body's own immunity is charged, ready for active engagement with COVID if you're unfortunate enough to catch it, but your own DNA is not affected. The messenger RNA given with the Pfizer vaccine is destroyed within hours of entering your body. Once it's done its job, it's dealt with. It doesn't remain in your system. You'd never be able to recover it again, and it doesn't enter your own DNA.
Very good, which brings us then to, I suspect, what will be the most challenging part of this interview for viewers. And Mike Beaumont's going to help us out with this in a moment. So, by the way, are the Catholic Church and the Jewish community. More about that in a moment. But the big question then, Rick, are these vaccines ethical?
Well, there's probably a number of questions to answer within that question. I mean, one of the big ethical challenges, I suspect, is going to be the distribution of these vaccines. You know, advanced countries, wealthy countries, Western Europe and North America particularly, have plowed billions and billions and billions of pounds and dollars into the development of these things. It's understandable that those governments will want to protect their populations first. As Christians, we'll want to be, you know, we're concerned for the poor and the needy and the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. And if, as seems likely, the Western world, which has pre-ordered 2 billion doses, gets first dibs on all the vaccines, then the developing world will have to wait months before they get any vaccine. And in that time, many, many more will die. If we could distribute the vaccines globally on the basis of population rather than on the basis of financial muscle, then we would get on top of this pandemic more quickly. But some people in the West would have to wait longer for their vaccines. So there's an ethical issue there, isn't there, in distribution? But probably
we'll come back to that in a moment when we ask what can we do, which will be my last set of questions for you. But
okay.
What about the vaccine itself and us taking it? Are there ethical challenges there? What should we?
Yeah. The main ethical challenge that you'll be referring to is concern about the way in which these vaccines are both produced and tested. Way back in the 1970s and 80s, certain cell lines, human cell lines, were developed using tissue derived from aborted fetuses. And one of those abortions, it was a legal abortion, took place in the Netherlands, I believe, in 1973, has been used to either produce or to test the existing vaccines.
And is that normal, Rick? Is that unique?
Yes, this is normal practice. Indeed, most of the vaccines that are in use today, not just for COVID, but for a host of different diseases, have been derived using tissue from one or more of these aborted fetuses.
Just to earth that, Rick, would it be the case then that I've had yellow fever, polio, hepatitis, meningitis, and others, typhus, cholera? Would you suggest that all of those or most of those would have used that same process?
Many of them would have done, and certainly most of us will have had our children vaccinated against diseases like rubella and whooping cough and measles, which use these cell lines derived in this way. The advantage to the biotechnologists, the people who are trying to develop vaccines, is that these cells are well known. These human cell lines go on replicating truly, consistently, generation after generation after generation of cells. And so if you're a biotechnologist looking for predictable outcomes, it's very helpful to be able to work with human cell lines where the way their behavior is characterized very clearly. You know what you're getting from them. So it's understandable that they want to do that. The big question, obviously, for us is, are we in some way condoning the abortion industry by taking a vaccine that's been derived using such cell lines? I think it's important to say, Dave, that there's only one abortion that took place in 1973, which is in use in producing COVID-19 vaccines to date. And there's no actual fetal tissue which finds its way into the vaccines. It's in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, these human cell lines using this HEK 293 cell line, as it's known, is part and parcel of the production process. With the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, it's not part of the production, but it is part of the testing process. So at the moment, there is no available approved COVID-19 vaccine which has not in some way involved the use of that cell line.
So Rick, let me ask you, and Mike, I'll ask you in just a moment, thanks for your patience, your bioethics Christian medical fellowship, how do you square then Christians taking the vaccine?
Well, I think you've got to ask a number of questions. If you're very remote in time or geography from the original, well, perhaps I should say straight away, I would be one of those who is wholly against the evil of abortion as we see it today. That, you know, in the UK, 200,000 pregnancies are terminated every year through abortion. And I want to be amongst those who are raising their voice against that.
Okay.
Loud and clear, and have worked with pregnancy crisis centers all of my Christian life virtually. So I would want to make that clear. But in trying to decide what the culpability of a Christian today is for an event, a single event that occurred nearly 50 years ago, we have to ask ourselves, you know, are we involved intentionally or unintentionally? Are we involved passively or actively? Are we involved remotely or in a sort of hands-on way? These are all questions that ethicists would try and apply to arrive at a conclusion about our culpability. For me, I don't feel that I am in any way condoning that historic abortion by taking advantage of the vaccines that have been developed using that cell line. In fact, I think I prefer to see it consistent with the redemptive nature of God, that he has given science and biotechnologists the wisdom and the skills to derive from, even from that sad and tragic event all those years ago, some benefits, some good outcomes, that it's in keeping with the redemptive heart of God to bring good out of evil. And I prefer to look at the provision of these vaccines, which are undoubtedly going to save many thousands of lives, something in keeping with the heart of God. So for me, it's not an issue of feeling somehow contaminated by that, but I appreciate that that's a personal view, and it's not necessarily a view that would be shared by all Christians. And I think we're going to need to be willing to accept that folks will arrive at different conclusions on this issue.
Very good. So Rick, I'm going to pause just there for a moment. Folks, you'll see up on screen, I spent a little bit of time myself looking at what the Roman Catholic Church would say about this, knowing their strong view on abortion, and the same with the Jewish community. You can see up on the screen now that for the Jewish community, it's a mandate to take the vaccine. And for the Roman Catholic Church, again, you'll see it pop up on the screen just now. It's encouraged that Roman Catholics take the vaccine. And it's interesting The Roman Catholics and the Jewish community view it as a human responsibility in terms of protecting the lives and well-being of others. So it's not so much about what it's doing for me, it's actually what I'm doing for the good of others. I just think that's really interesting. Mike, let me draw you in here. Mike, what would you say about this question? Are they ethical, these vaccines?
Well, I think I would want to say two main things, Dave. There has to come a point when what has happened in history is no longer binding on us, or where we can be responsible for it. I mean, after all, the Old Testament prophets look forward to a day when the sins of the father would no longer be visited upon their children. And I think this is perhaps an example of that. So I would agree with the position that sees the original cells from the aborted fetus as being so far removed from us now as to be no longer relevant to us and binding on us. And I would say this, if we did take the sort of harder line that no, we shouldn't have this vaccine because it came way, way back from an aborted fetus, then I think we're going to have to rethink an awful lot of other things. We would have to immediately close our pensions and our bank accounts, because most financial institutions have been built in history on the back of the slave trade. You know, we'd have to stop trading with a lot of the companies that we do that were built from similar sources. Actually, many of us would have to stop using our civic parks, because they were often gifted to communities by people who had made a lot of their money in the Industrial Revolution that gave them wealth out of the slave trade. And life would simply be unlivable if we were to trace back everything to where the money had originally come from. So I think practically there has to be a point when we say we have to cut off here. We are now so far removed from that we can't continually keep carrying the burden for it. And we do take hold of the truth that the sins of the fathers will no longer be visited on their children. I think the second thing I would say is, abhorrent though I would say it was as a Christian, that original fetus that was aborted, that life that was aborted, would have been aborted anyway, whatever I believed about it and whatever we did with it. So I think the good that came out of that original aborted fetus, that way down the line has led to the development, not just of this vaccine, of course, but of many vaccines. I think it could validly be seen as an example of the grace of God taking the mess and the sin that humanity so often brings about, and his gracious reworking of that to use it redemptively for some good. And so I'd probably see this as an example of redemption, of God taking what is not good, what is wicked, but bringing some good out of it. So for me, those would be the two main points that I think I would focus on from a sort of theological, biblical point of view. And I'm pleased that the Pope has taken a similar line as well.
Thank you very much, Mike. Rick, back to you then for the last question. What can I do then? You raised the ethical dilemma of distribution. You've raised the ethical challenge, but given us your journey through that as someone who's trained in bioethics and works with the Christian Medical Fellowship. So those two things in particular, I guess, are in my mind. You may have other things. What can I do as an individual?
I think the first thing I'd say is be thankful that this horrendous pandemic is now, well, we've got at our fingertips the weapons with which to attack it, and I think that's a hugely hopeful thing. Entering a new year, there's a long way to go, but at least we're at the start of turning the tide against this pandemic. Let's hope and pray so. So I would be grateful to God for that. I would want to be amongst those who raise their voice on behalf of the less developed and poorer nations of the world, so that some justice, some so that compassion and justice in the distribution will take place. I was reminded by John Wyatt's article on these things of that time, 20 years ago now, when Christians raised their voices to help bring relief to the mountain of debt that the so-called third world countries in those days, that's what they were known as, faced. I mean, they had borrowed enormously from the wealthy West and were being charged extortionate rates of interest, and there was no hope that they would ever be able to be free of those debts. And the Jubilee campaign went to work, and Christians were prominent in that campaign to campaign for the forgiveness of those debts. And it made an enormous difference to those countries to be forgiven those debts and no longer have to pay that interest. I'd love to see something similar to that, akin to that. Christians raising their voices to say, come on, let's make sure that the third world is not left behind. The underdeveloped countries are, and the less able to purchase their vaccines. Why not, for every vaccine that we give ourselves in this country, why not pay for another person to be vaccinated in a much poorer nation of the world? Something along those lines. I'd like there to be a great cry coming out from the people of God.
Let me just pause you there, Rick, for a moment. Folks, one idea here in the UK is write to your MPs, make that suggestion. And in the US, you would write to your senators, congressmen and women, and in other countries, you'll have your own political local or regional political figures that you would normally lobby. So let's consider that. Rick, I do want to ask you in particular, one of the things this has produced here in the UK, in particular in the USA, with some of my friends, I've seen it, the so-called conspiracy theories. You know, the government's going to inject me with a chip or whatever else the conspiracy theorists come up with. What can we do about that? Let's say we are concerned and we're even fearful of a conspiracy ourselves. What can we do positively about that?
Good question, Dave. There is a small section of conspiracy theorists who don't want to listen to hard facts and evidence. And I'm not sure that there's a lot we can do to dissuade those people. And the difficulty is, of course, that in the days of social media, that message spreads very quickly. But I think we've got to keep patiently and humbly speaking the truth. There is no microchip being injected with vaccines. I would just want to be loud and clear about the facts, because vaccination is a complex science. It's easy to get lost in the detail, and I was struggling myself in answer to some of your questions earlier, not to get lost in the detail. And I think it lends itself, therefore, to those anti-vaxxing movements. But I think the truth is that vaccination has saved countless millions of lives over the last 50 years or more, and has done enormous good for mankind. And the fact that these vaccines have been brought to the market so much more quickly than before is something to be celebrated, not to be suspicious of. Sometimes behind these conspiracy theories lies a story. For example, one of those theories is that Bill and Melinda Gates are somehow trying to collaborate with global authorities to plant a microchip, as you say. And that grew out of a story back in the end of 2019, where the Gates Foundation had sponsored some research into the possibility of having your vaccination history printed with smart ink on your arms, which could be read with a smartphone. And there was a certain technology that was being looked at that would make you carrying your medical record wherever you went, so that if you were involved in an accident or something like that, your history could be quickly gleaned from that ink record on your arm. It was not about putting a microchip inside you, but you can see how these conspiracy theories get based upon some little bit of truth, which is then distorted and
just
exaggerated.
to be clear, Rick, before I get inundated with
sorry if I made matters worse for you.
Worried Christians, we are not getting smart ink with this vaccine, correct?
No, not getting smart anything, except a smart piece of biotechnology based on actually, the way that our bodies have been designed to deal with invaders, and we're just short-circuiting the natural way by which that happens to save many millions of lives, and to try and achieve sufficient herd immunity across the world that this virus cannot go on replicating successfully.
So just for the record then, Rick, Bioethics Christian Medical Fellowship, are you going to have the vaccine yourself?
You bet I will, yeah, as soon as it gets around to me, which will be a little ways down the road yet, despite my great age and decrepitude. It will be some time yet, but I think fourth wave for me.
Folks, I'm bringing this special broadcast to its end. Just to let you know, my wife and I will be first in the line for the vaccine. One little word of advice. If you get a lot of your information from Facebook, and Facebook is a wonderful resource. However, as self-confessed, Facebook will tell you, they will feed you news that you've previously designated an interest in by your downloads, your conversations, and so on. So if you find you're getting a lot of conspiracy theory posts from Facebook, it's not because they're more true, it's simply because that's what you've been accessing in the past, and Facebook will try and please you by serving up even more. So just be very wary, and please do not share, post, or like conspiracy theory material unless you've actually taken the trouble to go to the source and check out the facts yourself. Please do that, at least, as one more thing we can do. Father, we do thank you for the incredible speed at which these vaccines have been developed. I want to pray for everyone watching for whom the ethical concerns may yet be a challenge. Pray for wisdom from above. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask, and it will be generously given. My paraphrase of James chapter 1. Pray for wisdom for each of us, and pray that we would each as Christians take our responsibility, not just to have the vaccine for me and my protection, but to have it for the safety of others, and to think through what we can do about those less fortunate who may not have the opportunity anytime soon. Thank you, Rick Thomas, Mike Beaumont, for your comments and your wisdom today. Really appreciate it.